Nice you. You ready? All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming in on a snowy Cleveland winter day. I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean at Case Western Reserve's Law School. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today and to welcome you to another one of our fantastic events. This event is being hosted by our Cox International Law Center, and it has been organized by Professor Avedon Cover here, who is the director of our Institute for Global Security Law and Policy. And the Cox Center has had a lot of success, as many of you know. It has been ranked by U.S. News and World Report as the 19th best international law program, but Pre-Law magazine just ranked it among the top 10 in a magazine issue that came out just last week. So we're really excited about all of that kind of attention. Part of what gives us our attention is our students, and I am happy to announce that our students, one of which I see back there, is there anybody else from our Jessup team? Okay, that's Elizabeth Safier. Our student Jessup team went out to Chicago to compete, and they came back with all of the trophies. They won the Chicago Championship. They won the third best brief award, the best overall speaker award, a bunch of other speaker awards, and Elizabeth and her partner Laura argued the quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals in a row and beat the other teams and brought Case Western Reserve a lot of glory. So good for you, Elizabeth, and our students. Well, one of the things that makes the Cox Center so special is the quality of the people that we're able to bring in for lectures. And I know that's why many of you have come from far and wide to hear today's lecture. Our special distinguished lecturer today is Tamara, and is it pronounced Wittes? Wittes. I'm just going to get that right. Tamara Wittes. She's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She wrote a book about the decline of Arab autocratic states in 2008. And then she found herself working for President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton in the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau of the State Department at the time when the Uprisings threatened to collapse those very regimes in 2011, something that we fondly know as the Arab Spring. Now, the Arab Spring didn't always work out so well. It turned into the Arab crisis, one of which is still a major problem, and that is, of course, what's going on in Syria. In today's talk, Tamara will describe how her scholarship of Middle East politics and policy prepared her for that moment and what it left out for her to discover. When truly unexpected events hit U.S. foreign policy, is it possible for policymakers to apply the lessons from the past and learn new understandings while managing a crisis? That's what we're going to hear today. In addition to serving as a senior fellow at Brookings, Wittes is a co-host of Rational Security, a weekly podcast on foreign policy and national security issues. She is currently writing a new book, which we all can't wait to see. It's called RSOBs, and it's on the tangled history of America's ties to autocratic allies. Without further ado, please welcome a warm Case Western Reserve welcome for Tamara Wittes. And I do have a present for you because it's so cold in Cleveland.
Wow.
You should not leave without a Case Western, please.
Thank you. I love it. Thank you so much. It's a treat to be here with the snow falling because in DC we really haven't had much of a winter at all. And so thank you for the winter weather. Thank you for a reminder of why I left the Midwest. I grew up in Michigan and I went to college at Oberlin. So these winters I am all too familiar with. But I certainly don't mind at all. In fact, I'm delighted to spend a couple of days in this Northeast Ohio winter with you. And I really want to thank you, Dean Scharf, Avi, Eric, for making this trip possible. I had a chance earlier this afternoon to meet with some of your amazing students. And I wanted to come out because one of the lessons that I've taken away from our recent political turmoil in Washington is the need for those of us who work on policy, and especially on American foreign policy, to spend more time talking to the rest of America, talking with the rest of America about what we do around the world. It is just delightful to come to Case and to see a law school that has such a commitment to public international law and to helping students gain the experience and go into public service. So I really want to commend you, and it's really great to be here. We're meeting at a bit of an inflection point. I think a big inflection point in terms of the role that the United States plays in the Middle East. And we're having a bit of a national debate about it. If you think about one of the Democratic presidential debates a few weeks ago, there was about a half an hour of conversation about whether or not the US should have military forces in the Middle East, and if so, what they should be there for and why. And I think that we are at that inflection point partly because of broader questioning within our own society about America's role in the world, and kind of coming off of a long period of intense international engagement to question what we've achieved, what's valuable, what's important to us, and why, how much should we invest in it. But so that we have changes here at home that are kind of forcing that debate, but there are also broader changes in the international system and in the Middle East itself that are helping to drive that debate. So what I wanted to do was just talk for a few minutes about those changes and about why we're having this debate about the US role in the Middle East beyond the obvious issues that are in the headlines every day. And then I want to pivot and talk a little bit about what it takes when we want to translate our analytical understanding of what's going on in the world into the policy work of deciding what the US government should do in a given set of circumstances, okay? So I said that there are changes in the world that are affecting how we think about the Middle East and its place in American interests and its priority for the United States relative to other regions around the world. And one of those big changes is that after 20 years after the end of the Cold War, when the United States was an unquestioned hegemon, the unquestioned superpower in the world, no one could challenge us militarily, economically, or in terms of our political and diplomatic weight. But that's not as true as it used to be. We are living in an era now of renewed geopolitical competition globally, with rising economic and political challenges from China, from Russia, that are demanding that our government think about how we want to compete in the world with these other major powers. What that means is that as our US government thinks about how does our economy compete with the Chinese economy, how does our tech compete with Chinese tech, how does our energy compete with Russian energy, we have to think about the opportunity costs to the United States of being so deeply invested in one region of the world as we have been in the Middle East over the last 15 or 20 years. The opportunity cost for the United States of being so deeply invested in the Middle East relative to other regions, those costs are rising. And so that's one thing that's driving our debate. Another thing that's driving our debate is changes in global energy markets. When the United States first got involved in the politics of the Middle East, when the United States first sent its military into the Middle East, that was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. We were an industrial power going gangbusters, and we had major energy needs. And so we wanted to help secure the flows of fossil fuels from the Middle East to the United States, but also to the world. And the more we became a global trading force, the more that energy supplies to the rest of the world mattered as much to us as energy supplies to the United States itself, right? So if our trading partners' economies crash because oil prices spike, that matters to us too. We are in an era today where Middle Eastern oil, as a share of global energy supply, is shrinking. That's not because the Middle Eastern countries are pumping less oil and gas. It's because other supplies have come online, including here in the United States, but also in West Africa and other places. And it's because a lot of the energy market is starting to shift toward non-fossil fuel sources of energy, right? And that trend will probably accelerate. So, Franklin Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz at the end of World War II to build a relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and help the kingdom develop its oil resources so that they could supply the needs of the Western industrialized world. And for decades after that, American energy secretaries would fly regularly to Riyadh to meet with the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to talk about how to keep oil prices stable and not too high. We don't do that anymore. I can't think of the last time the US Energy Secretary flew off to Riyadh to talk about global energy prices. Middle East energy just matters less to us than it used to. And that's also driving this debate. And then we have the very obvious shift in the kinds of security challenges that the Middle East faces and that the United States has taken an interest in the Middle East. Obviously, for the last 2 decades, the US has been fairly intensively engaged in counterterrorism operations across the region. But that isn't what drove our military and security engagement in the Middle East. What drove it was a concern about interstate wars, big land wars, air wars, interstate wars between the Arab states and Israel in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982, and other interstate wars like the Iran-Iraq War, which raged for 10 years. Today, the United States cared about those interstate conflicts partly because of the Cold War context, America's global competition with the Soviet Union. Those interstate wars created opportunities for Russian influence, Soviet influence in the region, and sometimes for American influence in the region. But today, the security threats that the region faces are quite different. Civil conflict, mass migration, sometimes conflict-induced, sometimes climate-induced, sometimes both, and terrorism and insurgency. And that's a very different kind of security challenge that demands a very different kind of response. And one thing that I think should be clear after 19 years of fighting this battle in the region is that large numbers of American military forces are not necessarily the answer to that set of security challenges. And that is driving a lot of our domestic debate today. So in that Democratic primary debate the other night, the question was about troops. It was just about troops. It wasn't about what should we do? What do we care about in the Middle East? How much do we care? It was just about, do you want troops in the Middle East or not? Should we put them in or take them out? Okay, what I'm getting at is that debate on TV was actually about a bigger debate that we are having now as a country. Now, this shift in our own thinking about this region, this part of the world that has been an important focus of our policy for a long time, has come about simultaneously with a lot of change in the region itself. A breakdown in the international order of the Middle East, the geopolitical order of the Middle East. And a breakdown of certain states in the Middle East that have collapsed into civil conflict. And we can say that that breakdown in order is a result, in some sense, of the uprisings of 2011. But I don't think it's right to say that those popular uprisings caused the conflicts. And let me explain why. I actually came to the Brookings Institution originally in the winter of 2003, and I was hired there to study Arab governance and to study the emerging debates within the Arab world about political reform and economic reform. This was a period when there was rising civil society activity, rising scholarship by Arab economists and political theorists and intellectuals about what was holding their societies back from the aspirations they had for themselves. It was also a period of time when the World Wide Web was producing things like Facebook and giving people new platforms where they could connect with each other, discuss, share ideas, find common interests, organize around those common interests. Now, authoritarian governments caught up with people on social media, so now we can ask whether social media is a force for individuals or a force for governments. But at that time, there was a flowering of debate, conversation within the region about the need for reform. And what people meant by reform, by and large, was democracy, was governments that were more transparent, more accountable, more effective at responding to people's needs, and that gave people more room to participate in making decisions about their own societies and their own communities. So these uprisings that came about in 2011 came about partly because of the technological change that I talked about, partly because the Arab autocratic governments had been running on a model where they collected funds either from oil income or foreign assistance, but not from taxes mostly, and they provided goods to citizens. So they were the source of services and goods in society. And that model was beginning to fail. It was beginning to fail both because it was growing increasingly corrupt and inefficient, and also because the populations of these countries were growing quickly. They had a lot of young people in them, and young people can be a force of incredible dynamism in society, but they're also very expensive to raise and educate and keep healthy, and they're impatient, and they want to make decisions for themselves. And so the youth bulge within Arab societies also was a driver of the uprisings, a driver of change. So these states that had survived for decades using ideology, using this sort of corporatist, clientelistic economic model to survive, and of course, at the end of the day, like all autocratic governments, use coercion when they needed to survive, right? But the ideology wasn't working so well. The political economy, the clientelism wasn't working so well. And so they ended up falling back more and more on coercion as these demands and debates grew and grew. And that's what produced the uprisings in 2011. Now, those uprisings claimed a couple of leaders in Tunisia and Egypt. And then other leaders in the region who saw what had happened in Tunisia and Egypt realized that if they just used enough coercion, they could keep themselves in power. And it's no accident that when we look at the Middle East today, we see places like Libya and Syria are the most violent and disordered places in the region, because those are the places where leaders chose to respond to popular demand with the use of force. And when governments turn their guns on their own people, they create a market for other guys with guns to protect people from the government. And then you have a civil war. And so in the Syrian case, what began as a peaceful uprising, over the course of 7 months, morphed more and more into a civil conflict. And now here we are, a decade later almost, with more than half of the population of Syria displaced from their homes, both internally and outside the country. Now, that breakdown of order in the region naturally unsettled even the governments that survived. And so what we have in the Middle East today is not just civil conflict, but also geopolitical competition amongst the states of the region. And a lot of these civil conflicts have become proxy conflicts, battlegrounds, where surviving states are fighting for power and influence across the broader region. We see that in both Libya and Syria. We see it in Yemen. And all of that violence, competition, disorder, all of the anxiety of the remaining governments about their own security and survival, all of that is being felt here in the United States as well, where governments who are longtime partners of the US are very anxious, seeing that we're having a discussion about how much we care about the Middle East. And the result is this sort of push-pull dynamic where governments in the region are trying to convince us that we still really need to care a lot about them, about their security, and we need to keep investing. But at the same time, they're worried that we're moving away, that we're lessening our commitment, and that leads them to act in ways that might be riskier or more aggressive because they think they have to secure their interests on their own without our help. And sometimes when they do that, they make things worse, like the Saudis in Yemen, which is an issue that I know is very much at the heart of some of your work here at CASE. So we have more self-help by partners in the region. We have more desire by the United States to do less, to share the burdens more. And we get this bitter push me, pull you kind of thing going on between the US and our traditional partners in the region. And so where are we today? We're kind of in purgatory, the US and the Middle East. We're not invested enough to really establish a new regional order, because in the midst of this much violence and this much competition and this many other actors with an interest, it would take a lot for us to establish a US-led order in the Middle East. And that's not something we're willing to do. But we're also too enmeshed to actually get out. So, for example, President Obama in 2011, after the second set of Iraqi elections and after a new government was formed under Prime Minister Maliki, pulled all American combat forces out of Iraq. Did that without using enough American influence, leverage, and investment to ensure that Prime Minister Maliki sustained an inclusive government in Iraq. And Prime Minister Maliki began to exercise his authority in a pretty sectarian manner and reignited a lot of conflict within society and created an opening for the extremists who became ISIS. And when ISIS became a threat not just to Iraq, but to the wider region, to Europe, to the United States, President Obama put combat troops back in Iraq in the summer of 2014. So that's an example of how this purgatory that we've been living in is operating on American policy. So I'm not here tonight to tell you how to resolve this debate that we're having in the United States. That's a hard one. My point to you is that if we're going to get out of purgatory, we have some very difficult choices to make. They are ugly choices. They are unsatisfying choices. They are choices that will carry costs almost no matter what we decide. But if we want out of purgatory, we're going to have to make some tough decisions. Now, I can tell you that as an analyst, okay? I look at US policy, I look at its impact in the region, I can tell you what I see. I've been analyzing American policy in the Middle East for 20 years. But from 2009 to 2012, I was doing something different. I was helping formulate US policy. I was helping implement US policy. And what I learned after a lot of years of analyzing, thinking that I understood, I learned that being on the other side of the table And doing policy formulation and policy implementation requires some different knowledge and some different skills. So I want to share a few lessons that I learned through this experience. First, I want to tell you that when I came to Brookings in the winter of 2003 to work on Arab governance, all of that analysis I gave you about why Arab autocratic regimes were starting to weaken and face these challenges, this wasn't some discovery I made, right? This was stuff that you could see and feel and read and talk to people about. And I wrote that research up into a book that I published in 2008 called Freedom's Unsteady March, America's Role in Building Arab Democracy. And that book analyzed why these autocratic regimes in the Arab world were starting to weaken and face challenge. And it also critiqued what the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, was doing about it. Now, Bush, you might recall, argued that Arab autocracy was one reason why some, and I want to emphasize, some small minority of people in the Arab world were vulnerable to the appeal of extremist ideologies. President Bush believed that people's frustration, anger, grievance at the repression under which they were living, the stagnation of their own societies, was making them more open to extremist ideologies. And so he argued that the US should support democratic change in the region as a counterterrorism strategy. I didn't think that made a lot of sense, especially given my understanding of what was leading to the demands for change in the region. But I did think that the region was changing and the United States needed to get behind that change and help move it in a positive direction. So the second half of the book was a critique of the Bush administration's approach. It was a critique of Bush administration programs, and one specific assistance program in particular. Now, 2008, it turned out, was a pretty eventful presidential election year here in the US. And I found myself in early 2009 with an unexpected opportunity. I got a call from the State Department from a career Foreign Service officer who was the Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs, who said, well, you wrote this book about this democracy promotion program in my bureau and told everybody what's wrong with it. Why don't you come into the department and fix it? I was like, whoa, okay, that's a challenge. So I came into the State Department by the time I got through my security clearance and all that kind of stuff in November of 2009. I was a political appointee for President Obama. And I was there from November of 2009 until the end of January 2012. It turned out to be even more serendipitous than I knew when I took the job. Why? Because I went into government thinking I need to help the United States government prepare for the change that is coming in the Middle East. And then the change landed on our doorstep. So let me share a few lessons from that experience of unexpected change. The first lesson that I learned is that knowing is not enough. I'd done all this research. I had valuable partners, friends, sources across the Arab world. I thought I understood. I predicted. Turns out that when I got into the government, of course, I wasn't the only one who was seeing these things, and there are parts of the government whose entire job is to see and predict what's going to happen in other parts of the world, right? And it turns out that the Obama administration itself, the political leadership itself, understood that things were changing in the Arab world and wanted the administration to prepare. And we had discussions across what we call the interagency, the State Department, Defense Department, Intelligence Community, Commerce Department, Treasury, and so on, White House, to get together and talk about what we saw, what we understood was going on, and what the United States might need to do to prepare, how it might need to think about changing its policy. But events overcame all of that preparation. Policy work is slow. We came into government in 2009 after the United States had spent decades building relationships with and investing in the stability of autocratic partners in the Middle East. So turning that policy in a different direction is not the work of a few months. You have to build consensus on your analytical understanding. You have to build consensus about what to do. And then you have to put the changes into place and actually make them real. That takes a long time. But history landed on our doorstep in December 2010 when the Tunisian uprising started. Tunisian uprising started at the end of December. The Tunisian president fled January 14th. January 25th, the Egyptian uprising started. February, I think, 14th, the Bahrain uprising started. By March, we had uprisings in, I think, 6 major mass mobilizations in, I think, 6 different countries across the region. Now, sitting in the Near East Affairs Bureau, that meant that not only were we trying to figure out what was going on and what US policy should be, and we were worried about governments that might shoot people and they shouldn't do that and stuff like that, but we also had embassies full of American diplomats in all those countries. We had American tourists in those countries. We had American companies doing business in all those countries. So this crisis wasn't just a policy crisis. It was a crisis for the entire United States government to make sure that our people are safe, which is actually the first responsibility of American diplomats abroad, is taking care of American citizens abroad. When you are in the middle of a crisis of that breadth, knowing is not enough. And I think probably almost no level of preparation would be enough. Second lesson I learned, my first day on the job in the State Department. Here I am, I'm a political appointee. I'm coming into the Near East Affairs Bureau, which is filled with career Foreign Service officers. Now, lucky me, I had a tiny edge because my dad was a Foreign Service officer, so at least I knew a little bit the culture. And I sit down with my new boss and his deputy, and they say, well, you're here for a limited period of time. What is it you want to do? I said, well, I want to remake this assistance program, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, remake it for the Obama administration, make it work better. And I think that the United States government needs to prepare for Egypt without Hosni Mubarak. Now, I didn't say that because I was predicting a revolution in Egypt. I was just looking at the actuarial tables, okay? Hosni Mubarak was, I think, 79 or 80 at that point. He had been in power since 1981. He had never designated a vice president as his successor. And there was increasing discontent even within the political elite in Egypt who didn't know what he planned as his succession. So I was just trying to get everybody to face the obvious, right? So my bosses nodded and they said, okay, good luck. And I found a colleague who worked directly for the secretary, and she and I agreed that this was an important priority, preparing for Egypt after Mubarak. So we started writing a memo for the secretary. Sensible? Well, I don't know how much you know about the way things work inside the State Department, but when you want to put a memo on the desk of the Secretary of State, there's a process that the document has to go through, which is it has to go around the building, and every office in the building that has a stake in that issue gets a chance to review the document, make suggestions or edits or comments, and then clear on it. That's called the clearance process, and that has to get done before it goes up to the secretary. Well, my friend and I tried 3 different times to get this memo through the clearance process and onto the secretary's desk, and we never did it. We never managed to get it through the clearance process. Why? like I said, this seemed like an obvious question to ask. Why couldn't the State Department clear this? Why were people unwilling to clear this memo and have it go up to the Secretary's desk? Well, turns out, here's lesson 2, that in government, there are some questions that are just too hard to ask. They're stinky questions that nobody wants to ask. Why? Well, you might look like you're not with the program. There might be some bureaucratic risk. Or in this case, I think the primary concern was, what if it got out that the United States government had written a document planning for an Egypt without Hosni Mubarak? What would that do to our relationship with Hosni Mubarak? Right? So that memo never made it to the Secretary's desk. And I learned an important lesson. Some questions are too hard to ask inside government. And for me, that really emphasized to me the importance of the work that people do outside of the government to ask those stinky questions. Whether it's in academia, as you're doing here, or in think tanks, as I do at Brookings, it is important that there are people outside government asking hard questions and forcing the conversation that inside government they can't necessarily have. And I try now that I'm back at Brookings to do more of that kind of work. Third lesson. I was an analyst, I was a political scientist. I thought I was pretty good at what I did. And I thought that, and I still think, that all of our accumulated human knowledge, all the wisdom in our universities that we convey to our fantastic students, they actually help us do better in the world, be smarter about our choices. I learned that analytical understanding only takes you so far, and in particular, it's no substitute for politics. And let me give you an example there. So Mubarak finally left office February 11th, and under the Egyptian constitution, the military council, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, took over governance in the country. Now, Egypt has always been fundamentally a military-led regime, but it always had a civilian president. And the military council, although they took on this job willingly, they weren't really comfortable about it. They would much rather be back behind the curtain where they're used to. So they wanted to have elections as soon as they could so that there would be a new president and they could go back behind the curtain. And the protesters in the street who had spent 18 days demanding that Mubarak step down wanted elections because they wanted to choose their own leadership. Now, one of my bosses was going out to Cairo for the first set of serious meetings with the Egyptian generals after the revolution to talk to them about what their plans were for the political transition. And as he was getting ready to go, he asked us to write a paper for him. If they ask for advice about how to do a solid, stable democratic transition, what advice should we give them? Well, here I am, a political scientist. I've studied authoritarianism. I've studied democratic transitions. I had a colleague on the White House staff who was a political scientist from Stanford, and he'd studied political transitions. So we wrote this lovely little memo and said, well, the wisdom of the field is that it's much better if you wait to have elections until you've written your constitution or your basic laws and everybody agrees on the rules of the game. It's better because then the elections proceed according to a clear foundation of rules. And it's better because it gives all the political parties time to organize and educate voters about who they are and what their programs are. And then voters can make a better choice and the parties can compete more fairly. Well, we thought this was great advice for Egypt because one of the things the general was worried about was that the Muslim Brotherhood would dominate in the elections because they were the only organized political party in the country after years of authoritarianism. So we gave this paper to my boss, and he went out to Cairo. And here's the thing. around the time he went out to Cairo, a friend of mine, an Egyptian activist who'd been involved in the uprising, came over to Washington for a visit, and she came over to my office, and she said, "Tamara, all my friends are still protesting in the square, but I'm getting ready for elections." I said, "Really? Why do you think it's so important to have elections quickly?" She said, "Look, Tamara, I have to be with the people. If I want them to listen to me, I have to be where they are. And the people want elections, so I need to be for elections." All of my political science wisdom did not equal her political savvy. And Egypt had elections within 6 months of the SCAF takeover. And guess what? The Muslim Brotherhood dominated the elections. Okay, last lesson is the difference between what I was trained to do as a political scientist and what I needed to know to be a good policymaker. And I think this is a lesson that's particularly appropriate in academic settings, because in academic settings, and especially in graduate school, and maybe especially in law school, you spend all your time honing your critical skills. You figure out how to evaluate arguments and evidence, right? That's what it's all about. You learn how to pick apart arguments that you read, find their flaws, pick apart solutions that are put in front of you, and understand where they might go wrong or how they might not work. And that's how I was trained too as a social scientist. But when you're sitting in the policymaker's chair, when you're in government, what is government fundamentally about when it's working right? It's about solving people's problems. That's what it's for. And so if you're going to be a good policymaker, you have to be a creative problem solver. And what I realized as I and my colleagues in the Near East Bureau would gather in my boss's office every morning to talk over these crises and how to deal with them is that I knew how to give my boss 100 solutions that wouldn't work. I knew how to give my boss 100 reasons why the solution my colleague proposed wouldn't work. But that was not what he needed from me. What he needed from me was a creative idea that maybe I wasn't sure if it couldn't work, and I could see a lot of ways that it might not work, but it might make things a little better. That's what policy has to do. It has to solve people's problems. And so I'm proud of the work I do as a political scientist. I'm proud of the work I do as a policy analyst. I'm really lucky that I get to sit at the Brookings Institution and try and help Americans engage in a thoughtful way in this debate about the future of our role in the Middle East and what we should care about and why. But what I need to integrate into my work now, what I try to integrate into my work now, is that element of creativity and the focus on problem solving. And what I want to leave you with, especially those of you who are in school here and interested in going out in the policy world, and we had this conversation this afternoon, don't ever lose that creative problem solving. Don't ever lose that focus on how to make things better, because that is what government service is ultimately supposed to be about. So let me stop there, and I will be very happy to take your questions. Thank you. Who wants to kick us off? Yes, sir. And please, there's a microphone that is coming to you, and I'm going to ask you please to introduce yourself.
My name is Brad Van Auken, and I'm just a lowly corporate real estate attorney. But I found this.
You make the world go round.
Yes, I do a lot of deals in the business, so I found your speech very interesting, and I appreciated it. But one thing that makes me curious and what your take on is our Crown Prince over in Saudi Arabia at a time, as you've pointed out, where their importance to us is on the wane, and they are supposed to have a feeling of insecurity or desire to improve relations, yet his actions of late have been very much contrary when you
Indeed.
think about Khashoggi and
Yes.
Pensacola and a multitude of other things. Well, can I get your take on that?
Thank you. That is a great question. So, first of all, full disclosure, Jamal Khashoggi was a friend. And he is not the only friend of mine who has been subject to brutality at the hands of the Saudi government. So I can't speak as an objective observer on this question. But let me try as a policy analyst to give you my best understanding of where we are in this relationship. The Saudis are feeling insecure about American commitment to them. You know, the United States put troops into Saudi Arabia to protect the Saudis from invasion by Saddam Hussein back in 1990, right? When the Saudi oil refining facility at Abqaiq was attacked by the Iranians this summer, we didn't retaliate. And they took that, among a bunch of other things, as a strong signal that we were no longer as committed as we had been to their security. Now, the particular approach that Mohammed bin Salman has taken to consolidating his rule within the kingdom and the way in which he has attempted to exercise Saudi influence in the region, I don't think that has much to do with their sense of insecurity about us, with the possible exception of the Yemen conflict, with the Saudi decision to intervene in Yemen. But kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister, that wasn't about us. Rounding up your cousins and leading businessmen and throwing them in the Ritz-Carlton and pulling out their toenails until they sign their wealth over to the government, that wasn't about us. In fact, even planting spies in Twitter to feed you information on people who are criticizing your government, I don't think that was really about us. I think he did that stuff because he thought he could get away with it. And, you know, why he thought that is a different conversation and one that we can have. But whatever motivated him, those actions and others have created a crisis in our bilateral relationship because when the United States government, and here I mean not just a given president or even the executive branch, but the Congress as well, when we have a relationship with a monarchy, we have to have faith in the guy who's going to be the monarch. And this is a guy who's behaved in a way that has led both Democrats and Republicans in Congress to wonder whether we can put faith in him. And that's why we have a crisis in this relationship. And so I think if the Saudis want to address that crisis, they're going to have to demonstrate a shift in their approach on these kinds of issues, whether or not, you know, we're giving them what they want in terms of security commitments. Yes.
Okay, I just want to check something.
Tell me your name, please.
Oh, my name is Anne.
Hi.
Hi. I just happened to be in Egypt during that period of time.
Yeah.
And we knew almost immediately after Mubarak was elected that there was a counter-revolution by the military. And did the U.S. government obviously knew that, or you would have known that through your analysis? Is that correct?
After Morsi was elected, you're saying?
Well, almost after the revolution, that it was mainly just set up by the military to get rid of Mubarak and let the protesters have a feeling that it was their revolution.
Well, I think it was their revolution. I don't think the military would have gotten rid of Mubarak if they were just left to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But I think once you have several million people in the streets and the security services, if you were there, you probably remember January 28th when all of those plainclothes thugs were out in the streets, burning cars, snipers on rooftops, shooting at protesters, right? And by the end of that night, the army had made a decision to interpose itself between the plainclothes thugs and the protesters. And that was, in my view, when the military made its choice. Okay, we're not going to shoot citizens en masse to put this protest down. The security services tried that. We don't think it's working, or we don't like it. I don't know why, but they decided they weren't going to go down that road. And ultimately what that meant was Mubarak was going to go. So from my perspective, even though it took until February 11th, that was the day it was over for Mubarak. Now, after that, what was the military's commitment to democracy? No, I don't think they were ever really committed to democracy. I do think that, you know, they wanted to say, yes, the protesters want democracy, the West wants democracy, sure, we'll have a democracy. They could have cooked the elections to prevent, you know, Morsi's victory. And as you know, there were 2 former military candidates that they probably would have been much happier with. So again, for whatever reason, and I don't know their motivations, they allowed that election to go forward in a relatively free manner. What they didn't do was allow the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Morsi, and his government to govern with a free hand, right? Now, I would argue that by the end of the year that Morsi was elected, by the end of 2012, he was already not governing in a democratic manner, right? Mm-hmm. So does that mean I think a military coup was a good thing? No. I think there are a lot of other outcomes that would have been better for Egypt's future. But that was the choice that the military made. Did the United States believe when Morsi was elected and inaugurated that the military would overthrow him? I was out of the government by then, but not to my knowledge, no. And, you know, I'll just add one more sentence, which is that in the spring before the coup, the spring of 2013, so this is after Morsi had declared himself above the law, when there was a lot of concern about the direction he was going in. I was in Cairo. I met with senior military officers. I was a civilian at that point. And they told me, no, we're never intervening in politics again. We don't want to do that ever again. So they, I mean, to my face, they just lied. Okay, where are we going next?
I have a question.
Yes.
So as a policymaker, we have a lot of lawyers here, would-be lawyers. What role did the law play? What role did lawyers play in your policy making? How did they help or not help solve problems?
Okay, so as you know, very often your client will decide what they want to do, and then they'll come to you and say, how do I do this legally, right? And the US government does that to its lawyers too, all the time. Of course, when you're talking about public international law, what's legal is itself a complicated question, right? But I will say that the State Department Legal Office is staffed with people who have tremendous expertise, not only in public international law, of course, but in the applicable US law and in our legacy of dealing with public international law on these issues. And so they can do what lawyers need to do to advise their clients well, right? Which is walk through the options, the implications, right? The risks and liabilities, and then policymakers can make their decisions. But that's by no means the only role that law and lawyers played in policymaking that I saw. In fact, a lot of the senior officials for whom I worked and with whom I worked are lawyers by training. And I think that actually legal training can be really good training for a policy career because you are so good at evaluating arguments and evidence. And a lot of what you're doing around the policy table is you're listening to contending voices with different empirical bases for their arguments, with different objectives in mind, with, you know, different logic. And you have to be able to sort through all that and figure out what makes sense. And I think legal skills are really, really good skills for that process.
Hi, Neil Wainblatt. So question, given the fact that actors from the Middle East can reach over here via the internet and create problems here, or you have an actor working on a nuclear bomb, how do you have a policy to disengage and also try to deal with these other things without disengagement, just leaving the field wide open to these, I'll call them bad actors?
Yeah, so the first thing is, this is one of the things that troubles me about this discussion that we're having in this country about America's role in the Middle East, is that we talk about staying or leaving, engaging or disengaging, and then what do we mean by that? Troops or no troops, right? But it's not an on-off switch, right? And engagement can mean a lot of different things. After I left the Obama administration, I wrote an article for The Atlantic critiquing the administration's policy in Iraq and Syria. This is what you get to do after you leave government, right? And you can air all the disagreements and all the battles you lost when you were in government. And my criticism of the Iraq policy was not that we withdrew our combat troops. It's that as we withdrew our combat troops, we also drew down our diplomatic presence and we cut our economic assistance. So we really did disengage, right? But we could have withdrawn our combat troops and increased our economic and diplomatic engagement. The United States had tremendous influence in the Middle East in the 1970s. We brokered the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty, right? We ended that era of interstate Arab-Israeli war. And we didn't do that with a massive troop presence. We had very little standing military in the Middle East during that period, very little. We were using other tools. And so that's the first thing, is we don't have to think about our role in the Middle East in black or white terms. We have to think about what tools do we want to use and at what level, okay? And anyone in the Pentagon or the State Department will tell you that military tools cost a whole lot more, you know, in terms of bang per buck than civilian tools. The second thing I'll tell you is that if we're going to get out of this purgatory I described, we have to be prepared to make difficult choices about the things we care enough about to invest policy tools and resources in, and the things we don't care enough about. It doesn't mean we don't care at all, but it means we're not going to make major investments. And I wrote an article about this last winter with a colleague in Foreign Affairs, and our argument was, you know, the prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace, this was December 2019 or December 2018, prospects are poor enough, and it actually matters to American interests little enough, relatively speaking, and everything is relative in policy, that we should stop investing in trying to make Arab-Israeli peace. Now that doesn't make me happy. I spent the whole first half of my career working on Arab-Israeli conflict resolution, and I still think it is really important for Israelis and Arabs. But I don't think it's something that the United States will get bang for a buck doing. And so I think that we should probably do a lot less. So those are the kinds of unsatisfying, ugly choices I think that we have to make.
I think with that, we're going to please join me in thanking Dr. Wittich. You're all invited to join us in the rotunda outside for refreshments. Do want a couple reminders. On February 25th at noon, there's a talk, Forced Migration, Human Trafficking, and Access to Hell by Tom Syring. And on March 2nd, 4:30, Derogation and Limitation of Human Rights, the Case of Kenya and South Africa, presented by Harrison Mbori. Thank you, everyone.